The grand reception hall of the Vaelith diplomatic residence had been doing something specific to people for 300 years, and what it did was make them understand that they were in a place where every detail had been considered. The ceiling carried the diplomatic seals of the Vaelith Confederacy's 47 member states in an arrangement that was both decorative and precisely hierarchical. The floor was a material that absorbed sound in a way that made the room's ambient noise feel curated, as though the room itself had opinions about what was audible and had exercised them. The lighting was calibrated to a spectrum that made everyone in it look as though they were being seen clearly, which was both aesthetically achieved, and Calder Voss had noted in his pre-reception briefing notes, probably intentional. He had been in the room for 40 minutes and had conducted 11 interactions, which he had assessed in real time as he went. 3 adequate, 5 good, 2 excellent, and 1 that he was going to review in his notes later because something in the response pattern had not matched his briefing documentation, and he wanted to understand the variance before he encountered it again. This was how Calder did his work, with the thorough, methodical attention of someone who understood that cultural attaché work was fundamentally about the gap between what the documentation said and what the room actually contained, and that navigating that gap correctly required taking careful notes on where they diverged. He was doing well, by his own assessment. His supervisor had told him before the reception that his first significant social deployment was going to tell him more about his instincts than 3 months of desk work, and she had been right. His instincts were good. They were also, he was discovering, products of his own culture's training, which meant they were occasionally going to do things that his Vaelith cultural documentation had not specifically addressed. He had not yet encountered a situation where this was a problem. Lady Vale Vorithana was part of the diplomatic social orbit he had been tracking for the previous 20 minutes, third-tier proximity, close enough to register but not so close as to require direct interaction, which was where the interesting social data lived in Vaelith reception culture. She was in conversation with 2 other guests in the Tier 2 cluster near the east window, and she had the composed presence of someone for whom this kind of room was entirely natural, not performing ease, but genuinely having it, in the way of people who had been in rooms like this for long enough that the rooms were simply furniture. She was also, he noted in the professional register that his training kept running regardless of other inputs, striking in the specific way of someone who understood that rooms had focal dynamics and had dressed accordingly. The Vaelith aristocracy maintained strong conventions around formal reception attire, and she had met the conventions and done something interesting with the margins that the conventions left available, which was, he understood from the documentation, a form of social communication in itself. He was filing this observation in the professional category when the handkerchief fell. It was a small thing, an ornate thing embroidered in the Vaelith fashion, the kind of accessory that formal Vaelith reception attire included as a matter of convention, which he knew from the briefing document on aristocratic dress. It fell from her hand as she gestured in conversation, and landed near his feet with the specific quiet of something small and delicate meeting a floor that had been calibrated to absorb sound. His hand moved. This was the thing about reflexes. They did not consult. His hand moved in the way that hands moved when something fell near them, in the deeply instilled manner of a childhood in which picking up fallen things was simply what you did when fallen things were near you. And he retrieved the handkerchief and offered it back with a slight bow, the slight bow being, according to his briefing documentation on formal Vaelith courtesy gestures, the appropriate acknowledgement when returning something to a member of the aristocratic tier. He was satisfied in the half-second after the gesture that he had done something correctly. She did not take the handkerchief. She looked at it in his extended hand. Then she looked at him. Her expression was doing something that he recognized, from the documentation on Vaelith facial communication, as containing multiple simultaneous registers. Amusement was present, clearly, and something more focused beneath it, and something that his briefing documentation identified as intent, interpersonal, significance bending, but did not resolve into a more specific translation. She leaned closer. "Do you understand," she said, in a voice calibrated for their proximity rather than the room, "what you have just done?" His translator rendered this with complete accuracy. He heard it with complete accuracy. He looked at the handkerchief, which was still in his extended hand, and then at her, and then at the room, where he had the specific and unpleasant experience of noticing that a number of people who had not been obviously watching him were now obviously aware of him in the way that awareness organized itself around something significant, focused, ambient, too distributed to be accidental. He had 37 pages of briefing documentation on formal Vaelith reception protocol. He reviewed them rapidly and unproductively in the next 3 seconds. He said, "I picked up the handkerchief." "Yes," she said. "You did." The expression on her face had settled into something that he would have described, in his briefing notes, as patient, and in possession of information the subject has not yet received. "Would you like me to explain what that means?" She said. He looked at the handkerchief. "Yes," he said, "I think I would." She guided him, with the smooth social efficiency of a woman who had been navigating receptions for 20 years and had, he was beginning to understand, been specifically navigating this one with a particular outcome in mind, to the slightly less traffic section near the north window, close enough to the main floor to be visible, far enough from the clusters to be private in the specific way that Vaelith reception culture created pockets of privacy within public space. This, his briefing documentation told him, was itself a communicative act. He filed this information and kept walking. She told him about the Vel Sorvan with the patient, precise delivery of someone who had rehearsed this explanation, because rehearsing it was part of having thought through the evening carefully. The handkerchief protocol was 3 centuries old, predating the current diplomatic residence, predating several of the Confederacy's current member states, built into Vaelith aristocratic social language in the way that things became language when they were used consistently enough across enough generations that they stopped being convention and became meaning. The drop was the offer. The retrieval was the acceptance. Together they constituted a formal declaration, not binding in the contractual sense, not a legal commitment, but a public social signal that carried, in the rooms where it was performed, the weight of centuries of understood communication. "You retrieved it," she said. "I retrieved it," he confirmed. He was looking at the handkerchief which he was still holding, because at no point in the past several minutes had there been an obvious moment to set it down. "I retrieved it because it fell and it was near my feet, and the alternative was leaving it on the floor." "Yes," she said, "I suspected that was the case." "You suspected," he said. "I dropped it knowing there were 2 likely outcomes," she said, with the honesty of someone who had decided that honesty was the operational register for this conversation and was applying it thoroughly. 1. That you would recognize the signal, retrieve the handkerchief understanding what retrieval meant, and I would have my answer. 2. That you would not recognize the signal, and an awkward misunderstanding would occur that could be managed discreetly and without social consequence for either of us. She paused. There was a third possibility, which I considered less likely and have now encountered. "Which is," he said, "that you would retrieve it from reflex without knowing the meaning," she said. "Which produces a situation that is neither of the 2 I planned for, because the gesture has been witnessed and recorded by approximately 20 people, and the social signal has been transmitted regardless of whether the transmitter understood what he was transmitting." He looked at the 20 or so people who were not looking at him. "Right," he said. "Which is why I asked you the question," she said, "because this is the only window available." He thought about this. He was a cultural attaché. His professional function was to understand exactly this kind of situation. The gap between performed gesture and understood meaning, the way social signals communicated regardless of the performer's intent. He had briefing documentation. He had training. He had 37 pages of formal reception protocol. He had 37 pages that did not contain the word handkerchief in this context, which he was making a note to address through the proper channels at his earliest opportunity. "The question," he said, "you asked if I understood what I'd done, if I had understood if I'd retrieved it knowing the meaning. Then your retrieval was a knowing acceptance of the offer," she said, "which would require a different conversation than this one. And since I didn't know, you are currently in possession of the information," she said, "which means the window is open. You may inform me that the gesture was made in ignorance, and I will communicate that to the appropriate parties, and the matter will be resolved without social consequence, yours or mine." She looked at him with the focused attention he was beginning to recognize as her primary mode. "That is one option." He was quiet for a moment. He was doing the thing he did with significant information, organizing it in the order that produced clarity before response. He had accidentally performed a formal courtship acceptance with a Vaelith noblewoman he had never spoken to before this moment, in a room full of witnesses, using his childhood reflex for picking up fallen objects. These were the facts. He looked at her properly, with the full attention he had been professionally deploying at partial capacity for the past several minutes. She was, he noted with the part of his brain that ran a background assessment regardless of what the foreground was doing, extremely composed for someone who had dropped a handkerchief as a calculated social action, and was now navigating the consequences of having miscalculated in an interesting direction. She was also, and he noted this with the professional register, and then noted that the professional register was not the only register it was present in, watching him think, with the patient interest of someone who had decided to see how he did it before she decided what to make of the result. "You said one option," he said. "There are two," she said. "Tell me the other one," he said. Something shifted in her expression, less in the direction of surprise and more in the direction of reassessment, the specific quality of someone updating a model. "The other option," she said, "is that I convey to the appropriate parties that the retrieval was performed knowingly, in which case the social signal stands and the formal partnership protocol proceeds from here." "Which would mean," he said, "formal courtship proceedings," she said. "Structured, documented, with defined stages and mutual exit options at each stage. Not a commitment to an outcome, a commitment to a process." He looked at the handkerchief for a moment. He looked at her. "I have two questions," he said. "Ask them," she said. "First, did you drop the handkerchief because you wanted to find out if I would pick it up, or because you had already decided you wanted to find out what came next?" She held his gaze for a moment. "The second one," she said. "Second question," he said. "The formal partnership protocol, is it documented anywhere? Because if I'm going to proceed from here, I need the documentation." She looked at him. The expression that he would later describe, in a note to himself that he would review with some frequency over the following weeks, as the moment he understood that she had also assessed the room and found something in it she had been looking for, that expression arrived then, specific and unperformed and completely her own. "I will have it sent to your office in the morning," she said. "Then my answer to your question," he said, "is that I understand what I've done now." He offered her the handkerchief with the slight bow that his briefing documentation had told him was appropriate. "And I'd like to keep having done it." She took the handkerchief. The room continued doing what it had been doing throughout, being a room in which 20 people who were not obviously watching them were obviously aware of them, and she held it for a moment in the way of someone completing a gesture that had been suspended for the past 15 minutes and was now, finally, at its appropriate end. "The protocol officer's name is Vaelith," she said. "He will contact you tomorrow morning. He is very thorough." "I prefer thorough," he said. "I know," she said. "I looked at your file." He opened his mouth and then closed it. "You looked at my file before you dropped the handkerchief." "I looked at your file," she said, with the precise amusement of someone who had researched a situation before acting on it, which was, he was beginning to understand, simply how she operated. Because I wanted to know who I was dropping the handkerchief near. She turned back toward the main reception floor with the smooth ease of someone for whom this kind of room was entirely natural. The documentation will be in your office before 8. I recommend starting with the appendix. She returned to the reception. He stood near the north window for a moment holding nothing. The handkerchief was with her, where it had apparently always been going, and looked at the room with the attention of a cultural attaché who had just had an experience that was going into the briefing gap documentation, and also into something else that did not have a professional category and was going to require a different kind of note. He went back to work. He conducted 4 more interactions, which he assessed as too good and too excellent, though he would later revise the assessment of all 4 to adequate on the grounds that his attention had been doing something it wasn't supposed to be doing during a significant portion of them. The documentation arrived at 7:53. Velkorath, the protocol officer, arrived at 8 o'clock with the specific energy of a person who had been given an assignment he considered professionally significant and had prepared for it with corresponding thoroughness. He was a compact Vaelith man of indeterminate seniority, who carried a documentation folder of a size that established, before he opened it, that the formal partnership protocol of the Vaelith aristocracy was not a brief document. The Velsorvan Partnership Protocol, he said, settling into the chair across from Calder's desk with the efficiency of someone who had given this briefing before and had refined it to its optimal form, has 14 stages. Not all of them apply in every partnership proceeding. The applicable stages depend on the circumstances of the initiation and the social tier of the parties involved. In your case, he paused, in the way of a man about to say something unprecedented, we will be applying the cross-designation provisions, which have not been invoked in the history of this residence, but which exist in the protocol documentation because the original architects were thorough. Good, Calder said. I prefer thorough. Velkorath looked at him. Lady Vorithana indicated you might say that, he said. Did she? She also indicated that you would have read the appendix before this meeting. I read the appendix, Calder said. I have questions about Section 4. Velkorath produced a separate, smaller folder from the documentation bundle. I prepared a supplementary brief on Section 4, he said, based on Lady Vorithana's assessment of likely questions. Calder looked at the supplementary brief. He looked at Velkorath. He thought about a woman who had looked at his file before dropping a handkerchief and had told him to start with the appendix and had apparently predicted his questions for a supplementary brief. How long has she been planning this? He said. Velkorath's expression did the specific thing that Vaelith expressions did when they were managing information they were not authorized to share. The protocol requires me to remain neutral on matters pertaining to either party's strategic approach, he said. That's not a no, Calder said. Section 4, Velkorath said, opening the supplementary brief with the focus of a man steering a conversation back to its documented structure, concerns the Velkethori introduction sessions, which are the first formal stage. There are 3 of them. The first is scheduled for next Thursday. Calder picked up the supplementary brief. He read the relevant section. He read it with the thorough attention he brought to documentation, which had always served him well, and was serving him now in the specific, unusual way of documentation that concerned himself as a participant rather than as an analyst. The Velkethori sessions, he said. They're structured as social engagements with defined conversational parameters. Correct, Velkorath said. The parameters are designed to ensure both parties have the opportunity to assess compatibility across a range of relevant categories, without the social pressure of unstructured interaction. Think of them as organized conversations. Organized conversations during which we are evaluating each other. During which the protocol creates space for genuine assessment, Velkorath said, with the diplomatic precision of someone who had chosen space for genuine assessment rather than evaluation and felt strongly about the distinction. The outcome of each session informs whether both parties wish to proceed to the next stage. There are mutual exit options at each stage. Nobody is obligated to continue. I understand, Calder said. Do you have questions beyond Section 4? He had questions about Sections 7, 9, and 11, which he asked in the order they appeared in the documentation, and which Velkorath answered from the supplementary materials with the efficiency of a man who had anticipated the questions, possibly because Lady Vorithana had told him which sections to prepare for, and Calder was making a note about her operational approach that he was going to review at length when he had more data. After Velkorath left, he sat at his desk with the protocol documentation spread in front of him and thought about a gap in 37 pages of briefing material and what it had produced. He thought about it in the methodical way. Then he started a new section of his briefing notes, not the professional file, the other one, and began documenting what he knew, which was her name, her file, which he had looked up immediately after the reception, on the grounds that she had looked up his and fairness required reciprocity, the specific quality of her attention, the appendix she had told him to read, and the supplementary brief she had apparently predicted. He noted, at the bottom of the new section, that he was looking forward to Thursday. He noted, in the line below that this was information he was going to have to think about, because cultural attachés were supposed to maintain professional detachment, and he had been in this posting for 29 days and was currently experiencing the specific, inconvenient sensation of professional detachment becoming a project rather than a default. He closed the notes. He had 6 days until the first Velkethori session and a full week of actual work to do in the meantime, and he was a professional, and the work was what he did. He reopened the notes after 4 minutes and added a line about the expression she had had when he asked. The Velsorvan conclusion session was held 6 weeks and 2 days after the reception, in one of the diplomatic residence's smaller formal rooms. A room sized for exactly this kind of conversation, with the ambient quality of a space that had been used for significant decisions and had absorbed the weight of them over time. Velkorath had briefed Calder on the conclusion session the previous week, with the specific thoroughness he had brought to all 14 stages of the briefing process, and Calder had prepared for it with the thorough, methodical attention he brought to all significant occasions. He had drafted 3 statements. The first was a formal conclusion in the protocol's standard language, expressing gratitude for the partnership evaluation period and indicating that he had determined the proceedings should conclude at this stage. He had drafted it on day 32 of the 6-week period, which was 2 days after the second Velkethori session, and he had looked at it once after drafting it and not opened it again. The second was a modified version, in slightly warmer language, that indicated appreciation for the process and left more ambiguity about the conclusion. He had drafted it on day 38 and had also not opened it again. The third was shorter than both and contained no formal protocol language. He had written it on day 41 and had rewritten it on day 42 and was not going to tell Velkorath it existed. He arrived at the conclusion session room at the appointed time to find Lady Vael Vorithana already there, which was consistent with every structured encounter over the previous 6 weeks. She was always there when he arrived, which he had initially read as professional punctuality and had gradually reread as something more specific, which was that she was always there because she had decided to be there and had organized herself accordingly. She was sitting in the chair that the room's configuration designated as Party B, which was, and this was not in the protocol documentation, but he had observed it, marginally closer to the door than Party A's chair, which he had initially read as neutral positioning and had gradually reread as the same kind of thing. She arranged herself for these sessions in the way of someone who had thought about where she wanted to be. "Attaché Voss," she said. "Lady Vorithana," he said, and sat down. The conclusion session had a formal structure. Velkorath had given him the framework. Each party would indicate their determination regarding continuation. The indications would be exchanged simultaneously, and the session would proceed from there based on the result. It was designed to prevent either party from being influenced by the other's response before giving their own, a feature of the protocol he had appreciated, professionally, as elegant design. "Shall we begin with the formal structure?" she said. He had 3 drafted statements. He was holding the folder. He looked at the folder and then at her, and did the thing he did when situations had clarified past the point where the drafted material applied. He set the folder on the table. "I'd like to say something before we get to the formal structure," he said. She looked at the folder, she looked at him. "Go ahead," she said. "I have been doing research," he said, "for 6 weeks. In the way I do research, which is thorough, I've been told, to the point of being occasionally excessive." He paused. "I came into this process prepared to treat it as a structured evaluation, which is how I treat professional obligations, and which I thought was the appropriate framework for a formal protocol I had accidentally initiated by picking up a handkerchief." "That is a reasonable framework," she said. "At some point in the past 6 weeks," he said, "the framework changed." He looked at her in the direct way he had. He had realized over the course of the Vaelith sessions that she was waiting for him to deploy more consistently the full attention, not the professional version. "I have not been able to identify exactly when it changed, which I find professionally unsatisfying, but the data I have is clear regardless of the mechanism. I am not here to conclude this process. I am here because the process got ahead of where I was 6 weeks ago, and I have caught up with it." She was quiet for a moment. The room held its ambient weight. "You drafted the conclusion statement," she said. 3 versions," he said. "I didn't use any of them." "I know," she said. "You came in without your folder's first page tabbed." He looked at the folder, he looked at her. "You checked the tab placement." "I pay attention to detail," she said, in the tone of someone who had long since made peace with this being both a professional quality and a personal one. "I have been paying attention to detail for 6 weeks." She looked at him with the full attention he had been learning to read correctly, the specific focused quality of someone who had done their research and had arrived at a position they were going to deliver precisely. "I dropped the handkerchief because I had read your file and formed a hypothesis that I wanted to test. The hypothesis was that you were someone worth knowing better. 6 weeks is sufficient data to confirm a hypothesis of that scope." She paused. "I am also not here to conclude this process." Outside the door, in the corridor, Vaelith was updating his documentation with the expression of a man who was professionally obligated to remain neutral about outcomes and was exercising this obligation imperfectly. "The next stage," Calder said. "What does the protocol say about it?" "Stage 8, she said, "involves the introduction of the partnership candidates to each other's professional and social communities in a formal capacity. It is designed to assess compatibility in broader contexts." She tilted her head by the slight degree that he had learned over 6 weeks meant she was about to say something that had a second layer. "It also requires a significant number of joint appearances at formal occasions, which means you will need to continue developing your practical fluency in Vaelith aristocratic reception culture." He thought about 37 pages of briefing documentation and a gap in the handkerchief section. "I have," he said, "a very good protocol officer." "You do," she said. "He's been updating the cross-designation provisions in real time. He considers this posting the most professionally significant of his career." "I'll put in a good word," Calder said. "He would appreciate that." She stood, the movement that indicated a session was concluding, which had always meant in the previous 6 weeks that the structured part was ending and the ambient continuation of the day was beginning. "Stage 8 begins at the Confederacy reception next month. Vaelith will send you the documentation." "I'll read the appendix first," he said. She looked at him with the expression he had been cataloging for 6 weeks and had not, he was now acknowledging, been cataloging in a purely professional capacity for at least 4 of them. It was the expression of a woman who had dropped a handkerchief as a calculated action, and had encountered a third option she had not fully modeled, and had found the third option to be the most interesting variable in the situation. "I know you will," she said. She walked to the door, paused in the way she paused when she had decided something and was committing to the delivery. "Calder," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name in 6 weeks of structured formal encounters, which was, he checked the protocol documentation in his head, technically not yet within the designated stage, which she knew, which meant it was a deliberate small violation, which meant it was a communication. He had been studying her culture for 6 weeks. He was getting better at reading it. "Yes," he said. "The appendix to Stage 8, she said. "Section 2, read it before the documentation arrives." She opened the door. Outside, Velkoreth was standing in the corridor with his documentation folder, and the expression of a man successfully maintaining professional neutrality at some personal cost. "Good afternoon." She walked out. Velkoreth watched her go and then looked at Calder with the folder held ready and the expression of someone preparing for a briefing he had been hoping to give. "Stage 8, Calder said. "Stage 8, Velkoreth confirmed, with the specific energy of a thorough man given a thorough task he considered professionally significant. "Shall we begin?" "Tell me about Section 2 of the appendix first," Calder said. Velkoreth opened the folder to a tabbed page that had, Calder noted, been tabbed in advance. "I thought you might ask that," he said, and began.